Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last 2024 event for 100 Pictures of Honey. This is the end of the third year of the series, which is wild to me to think that 3 years have gone by already. If you're new to the series, you haven't heard of it before, you can find our channel on YouTube has all our past readings from the past 3 years. If you ever just need some poetry in your life, need to just turn on a little video, and lots of wonderful people. I want to particularly welcome today Dana Delibovi and Molly Peacock. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Um, and they'll be reading from and discussing their new collections. Dana's is Sweet Hunter and Molly's is The Widow's Cranbox. I will be sharing their very long and accomplished bios in the chat so that you can hear more from them and less from me. And at first glance, if you were to look at their books side by side in the bookstore, you might wonder, you might say to yourself, well, these collections probably have nothing in common. Like, after all, what could the rapturous devotional poems of a 17th century saint possibly have to do with a chronicle of loss and memory that comes with widowhood? But I think today in their conversation, I think you'll find out why these two collections kind of speak to each other. So I'm going to ask each of them if they would to start us off with a poem, and then I'm going to ask kind of a general question to hopefully kind of start off their conversation. If you have questions during the course of their conversation or their reading, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to be trying to keep track of them so that, if they're further up, we don't lose them. And then kind of at the end of the conversation, we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So thank you for being here, Dana. Thank you for being here, Molly.
Thank
And
you.
I'm not sure which one of you may like to start with a poem. I'll let you choose.
Molly, why don't you go?
Uh, okay. Um, Thank you, Dana. Dana and I have been, as we spoke together on Hans podcast, and we've spoken together at the New York Society Library. So she always lets me go first in the age before Mal, as we all know what that means. I When I constructed the Widow's Cranbox, which is a book-length elegy, but it's not drearily elegiac in tone. It's got all kinds of tones in it. I wonder, what am I going to do to begin this? How do I set a tone, even though I'm going to disrupt that tone later on? So this is the first poem in the book, and a number of people here who've been at other readings have heard this, but I'm going to start off here anyway because I feel that somehow this is the place where I dip my foot into the pool of what I have to say. And there's, in fact, a pool image in the poem. It's called Touched, and it is also, in a strange way, connected to the 16th century Christian mystic poet, Saint Teresa of Ávila, whom Dana Delibovi has so beautifully translated and she'll be reading next. When I feel moved and then say I am touched, it's another presence inside me I sense. The dip of an oar, a canoe being launched. I'm the oar, but I'm the water. And sense at once initiation and response. After you died, I felt you next to me. And over months, you entered gradually into that lake and disappeared. Not gone, but so internalized, you're not next to me. You're not the port or the support. You're done being you. And my loneliness is so extreme that I feel moved by almost anything, even the forehead of a dog that leans against my knee in an elevator. Things as brief as all the ways you would lean against me, getting a glass of water at the sink. Everything touches me now that I'm not touched, but moved. That's touched.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank
I
you
love
so
that
much,
dog's,
Molly.
that dog's forehead gets me every time.
Yeah. Well, today we're here to talk about elegy and remembrance in poetry. And Molly just read a really exquisite poem that is an elegy and a beautiful remembrance. Her whole book is, in one way or another, elegiac. And Saint Teresa of Avila, who lived from 1515 to 1582 in Spain, and who was a mystic and a religious reformer and a well-known prose writer in her day, was also a poet. And she also wrote quite a number of elegies. And her elegies is, we'll probably get into this more as the program goes on, but her elegies were of three types. She wrote elegies to saints. She wrote elegies for the death of Christ, being a religious Catholic woman. And she also wrote elegies for herself. And I will explain that as we get farther along. But right now, what I'm going to read for my first poem is an elegy she wrote to a saint. The saint is Saint Catherine, the martyr, who was an Alexandrian saint and was martyred for her faith. The poem is To Saint Catherine, the Martyr. Oh, I should mention one thing. You will hear her talk about a spouse and a husband. The spouse and the husband is God, Christ. O passionate lover of unending God, radiant star, protect us. Still a girl, you took a spouse. He loved you so much, he gave you no rest. Anyone timid can't come to God. The timid can't cherish life and death in God. Cowards, see this girl? She doesn't value gold or looking pretty. She's already deep in the war of persecution, ready to suffer with a boundless heart. She grieves a life apart from her husband, but somehow in her torment, she found peace. Everything is joyful. Now she wants to die, since she cannot live with life. If we intend to delight in her joy, let's never get tired of finding her peace. Oh, what a devilish deception. Oh, how hateful to want to heal while the pain lives on.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm just, like I said, I kind of start you off with just like a thing that I noticed in reading both of your collections, um, is the idea that is sometimes difficult when we're in the midst of it to see that there is beauty in loss and surrender, right? And then in this way, elegy becomes a living testament, something that keeps a memory alive rather than solely a dirge, or a mournful type of song. And Dana, in your book, I was struck by kind of how religious devotion is in its own way is an elegy for earthly concerns in favor of, you know, a divine relationship or divine presence. And Molly, I was really struck in your book, and you mentioned it a little bit in your introduction, by your ability to access the beauty and the pain of the loss of a beloved through things like humor and wordplay that we don't normally associate with poems about loss. So I think that maybe we could start there with, like, do you agree that that was something you were trying to get at? Or is that something that you could talk about a little bit?
Well, yes, that is something that I was trying to get at. And I'm gonna make I'm gonna do a little sidebar here. Unexpected, but in Gerard Manley Hopkins' desolate sonnet, "No Worst There Is None," which he wrote in the pit of depression, in an Irish school he was teaching at. And you can see a tremendous amount of wordplay in there. And the more playful he becomes, the more that sonnet lifts. And suddenly, the same kind of joy that St. Teresa of Ávila is talking about when she, says basically, don't be timid. Don't be timid. You can bring joy to suffering. I'm paraphrasing poorly, but all of that mixes in to the idea of loss and what the experience of loss is. And I think we have a very drab idea of the experience of loss, that somehow an elegy is supposed to be a dirge. It's supposed to be all charcoal gray. And that's, I did not find that to be the case. What I realized as I was writing the sonnets in the Widow's Crayon Box, and there are two sonnet sequences that anchor this book, one of which is the Widow's Crayon Box. And I'm just going to read a little part of it. I'm going to read the first sonnet just to show you what I'm talking about, and also realizing that I probably had Gerard Manley Hopkins in the back of my mind. It wasn't conscious, but I think it was there. A mourning widow is still gray and mauve. A mourning widow, umber, barely moves. She's done as dread, the green of love removed. That's what I thought. Then death lit its fire and anger flared. It was the vermilion of grief disbelief. When Carolyn called, the ire of loss ignited, burnt sienna, unsoothed. She said you appeared on her morning run. Hey, get back here. Help me do our taxes. Your mourning widow never relaxes. The 8 child colors of crayon boxes are far too basic and behaved. I feel the 152 emotional shades. A rose one flurs before a peach one fades. Scarlet, orchid, cerise, umbrellas shield me from my own tears. Then I yield. That's the first sonnet in the Widow's Crayon Box, which gives the premise of the whole book, that our responses are a whole 152 colors of crayons in the big Crayola box.
I want to sort of tackle the subject of joy and the idea that there can be some joy even as we go through loss. Now, this is sort of a special thing for someone like St. Teresa, because she believed in an afterlife, which would have been joyful. But I think, to tell you the truth, more importantly for me, and I think maybe most people who are listening, is that she believed also that during this life, while we are physically alive, one of our jobs is to start detaching enough from our little plans and schemes, from our desires, from our wishes for things to go our way, and to begin in a metaphorical way to die within this life. And that this is a joyful thing. We die to the world, our attachments, so that we can find joy in a focus on our spiritual life. That was extremely important to her. And she herself did find joy and really communicated that joy in many of her poems. And I'm going to read one that does that. And as I mentioned earlier, she was an elegist about herself. And part of her elegiac work was to write about her process of detaching from the world so that she could live again in her spiritual life. And this is a poem about that. It is an elegy of that. And in the poem, she is giving up this life to move on to a life in God. And she does it in a kind of a sensual way. And that's based very much on a famous vision she had, which was that an angel came to her, speared her with a golden arrow, pulled the arrow out, which she found to be a very pleasant and painful experience all at once, and that this was a religious vision, that she felt that she was becoming closer to God through this vision. So she recaps this in this poem, and the poem is called About Those Words, My Beloved is Mine, which is an allusion to the Song of Songs in the Bible. I gave it all, relinquished all, and in this way I bartered. My love belongs to me, and I belong to him. When the sweet hunter shot me and left me wounded, when my soul lay panting in those tender arms, to balance out the cost of a new life, I took this trade. My love belongs to me, and I belong to him. He pierced me with an arrow, smeared with the poison of love, and my soul succumbed to be one with its creator. Now I don't want another. To my God I have surrendered. My love belongs to me, and I belong to him.
I want to kind of take off it. You mentioned something in Dana, in your speaking, like the almost sensual kind of quality of some of the poems, and I think that's another thing that I noticed in a way in both of your books is that there is this element of sensuousness in both of your books, sensuality. Dana and in Saint Teresa's poems, this almost romantic yearning to be possessed by God, and Molly, particularly the lots of specific sensory detail, but I found in your book lots of reference to texture and touch, which is rare. I think to find in poems, everybody relies on, the other senses, which we always write about. Um, so that quality of sensuality was also something that stood out in both books. I found that interesting that you mentioned that, Dana, and wanted to kind of just pop in and say that and see if you had anything else to add about that.
Well, I mean, first of all, let's just go back to the idea that the poem that Dana read of Saint Teresa's has echoes of the structure of the Song of Songs. What can I say? A foundational sensuous series of lyrics that we find in the foundational Christian book, so that just there to take us from the Song of Songs into Teresa's very, very earthy response to her spiritual life. And the idea of touch in poetry, and it's true, it's harder to get images of touch into a poem. I would say, I mean, I haven't done a thorough study of this, but my guess is that probably 90% of metaphors in poetry are visual. Then one gets some auditory sense, etc. But that whole idea of touch, the kinesthetic sense that we have, it's not lacking exactly, but it takes a certain sort of sensibility to go forward toward it. I don't know if there's a lot of touch in here, but this is a sensuous poem. I'm reading it because I know it's a favorite of Dana's, and also because as I was constructing the book, the first section is called After. Then the second section is called Before, and I felt that I had to establish what the relationship was before, because then the next section is When, and the last section is Afterglow. And I knew my husband since we were teenagers. We were boyfriend and girlfriend in high school. And we reconnected in midlife and married when we were 45. When we married, I knew that he was a cancer survivor. He had tremendous stamina, and he lived with melanoma, stage 4 melanoma, for 40 years. But that was a part of a fact of our life. That's way in the background of this poem. You don't hear it in the poem. You hear our 45-year-old reunion. It's called Threshold. And there are a lot of thresholds in St. Teresa's work. Just that idea of going through a doorway, going through a threshold, becomes very, very important. Threshold. We'd unhitched the shutters the night before and went to sleep on the pallets we pushed together to make a prenuptial bed, the window framing a darkness we ignored, too exhausted to make love, heads crushed into skimpy pillows. We had fled the first 45 years of our lives for this Spartan room. No surface lush with objects, just a table and a lamp, bags on the chair, suit and dress on the door. I woke before you, a 28-year habit after that. Mountains, amethyst, lake, opaline. Here was the start. To think that window had been blank the night before, and I didn't have to make the scene up. Water, sapphire, peaks, quartz. It wasn't art, but a threshold, and we'd arrived there. Threshold.
Really
Well,
lovely. Yeah. What do you think, Dana?
well, I am intrigued by this idea of a threshold. And I feel like when, just to bring it back to Elegy, Remembrance, this poem that Molly just read is very much a recollection of a way that, something opened up in a relationship. There was a door to go through, there was a new moment, there was a beginning. And I sort of feel that when we are remembering as poets and as translators, we are really often remembering these passages that happen, the moments that kind of stand out as these really important change points. And for someone like Saint Teresa, the ultimate change point philosophically for her, and it was throughout all of her writing and all of her life, was the movement of one's soul closer and closer and closer to God. I realize that not everybody has the sort of exact Christian belief that she had, but we can think of it a little bit as the movement of the soul closer and closer to, and closer to whatever spiritual sense, whatever sense that there's something beyond us or bigger than us that we want to connect with. And in Teresa's work, in her prose, probably her most important book of philosophy that she wrote is called Interior Castle. And it's the idea, speaking of a threshold, that the soul is traveling within itself closer and closer and closer to God, who is at the center. And this is a very early work about an idea that we really do take for granted now, that whatever our belief, our spiritual life is within us, not just something out there, whether that's in heaven or elsewhere. It is a search within. And she did write a poem about this. One of the things I love about her work is that, look, she was a public intellectual in Spain during her life, which is an incredible feat for a woman, really, when you think about it. And she wrote a lot of prose that's philosophical and theological. But being the down-to-earth person that she was, her writing is very conversational, very blunt a lot of the time. Her attitude was sort of like, well, if you can't read the whole book, I'm going to give it to you in a poem. And this is one of those poems where she did that. And it describes the relationship of one's own soul to an indwelling God, a God that lives within what she called in her prose work the castle of the soul. And she does talk about, in this poem, entering, knocking, and various thresholds of her connection with God within. And the poem is called Soul, Seek Yourself in Me. Oh, I want to say one more thing about it before I forget. What kind of guts did it take for a woman of that time to write a poem in the voice of God? This poem is written in the voice of God, which just goes to show you how close and comfortable a relationship she had with the divine. Soul, seek yourself in me. Soul, seek yourself in me, and through me, seek me in yourself. How lucky, cherished soul, to design yourself in me. No painter, however skilled, could imprint with so much delicacy the image that is you. I crafted you in love, beautiful and fine. If you get lost inside my tinted caverns, treasured soul, then seek yourself in me. What I know, your portrait hangs around my heart. And when you see the life drawn so deftly there, you will find rest. And if you haven't known before where to find me, well, don't walk from here to there. If you want to find me, look inside. Look for me in you. Because you are my chamber, my dwelling, and my house. And I will knock at any hour if I discover that your thoughts become a bolted door. Outside of you, there is no search for me. To find me, it's enough for you to call me, and I'll come to you without delay. To find me, seek me in yourself.
Beautiful. I wanted to maybe insert a quick question because I'm probably not the only person in the audience maybe that has this question for Dana first, and then I have a question for Molly after. Um, why Saint Teresa? Like, what is it about her that drew you to spend, all of this time with her work?
Well, I have a long, old relationship with her. When I was in college and graduate school, long time ago now, I discovered her philosophical work. I was a philosophy student at the time, and I read her as a philosopher. I wasn't a particularly religious person or any of that. I read her work from a philosophical standpoint, particularly Interior Castle, which is the book I mentioned, not so much thinking about soul as I was thinking about concepts of personal identity and selfhood, which you can glean from that book. So that was my first introduction. I was just interested in her too because she was a woman philosopher. And back in those days, we certainly didn't hear about many women philosophers. Well, time went on and I encountered a good number of problems in my life that felt insurmountable. And at that time, I began to explore faith again as a way to cope. And one of the books that I picked up was Interior Castle again. I picked up Saint Teresa again, and I read her now not as a philosopher, but somebody who might actually help me. A lot of years went by. I always was a fan of hers. Molly introduced me to a book, actually, Kathleen Medwick's biography of St. Teresa of Avila, and I read that avidly. It's a wonderful book. And then in 2019, I retired from my job in advertising, which I did for 4 decades. And I really just wanted to be translating poetry for no other end than honestly to get back to Spanish, because working on foreign languages was something I wanted to do as a retired person. And long story short, I started translating the poems. I translated all 31. I started publishing a few of them individually. I started publishing essays on it. And after a few years, I had a book. And it was no more planned than that. I just felt it was a very sure-footed, comfortable process. And here I am, very involved in St. Teresa.
Yeah, that's and while we're with Saint Teresa for a moment, Heather in the chat made a comment that it is interesting to me that the voice of God in the poem you just read could be the voice of Buddha. You will find me inside yourself.
Mhm.
Did you find in working with her poems that there were parallels to other spiritual practice or other philosophy that maybe you hadn't noticed before?
That was actually pointed out to me in an interview I did. Kevin McMahon, who's a writer who interviewed me, practices Buddhism. And he pointed out to me in the course of the interview that a lot of what goes on with St. Teresa, as Heather also pointed out in the chat, is very much like what goes on in Buddhism. There's an internal focus. There's a meditative approach. Teresa's concept of prayer is very much like meditation. And he also said that at the Buddhist center that he goes to, a lot of the people in charge there talk a lot about St. Teresa as a person that they consider to be a mystic in league with them. So I think Heather was really onto something there with what she pointed out in the chat.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And kind of in that vein, I want to shift over to Molly because I know that Molly, you have also been a biographer of different women. You've written a couple of wonderful biographies. So I'm wondering in a way in this book, the sonnet is the main container for what you do in this book. Um, is there a reason that these feelings fit best in sonnet form for you? Or did they start in other ways?
Well, in some ways, the story of this book is the story of the sonnets in this book is a little bit like Dana's. I'm just going to circle back to that notion of spirituality, which also exists in poetry very often. The poem is the journey to the self, and I also wanted to say something about Kathleen Medwick's biography of Saint Teresa of Avila, which is where I blurbed the biography, knowing her, and got more and more into this. And I just wanted to say also that Joseph Friedman in the chat makes reference to the Song of Songs, which is in the Old Testament, that it's usually read and recited as part of the Jewish liturgy during Passover. And I'm sure Dana will make some comment about this, but there is this very interesting Jewish Christian mix in Saint Teresa, and I first encountered this with her biographer, Kathleen Medwick, who is Jewish, who was drawn to the spirituality of Saint Teresa. So I'm sure that Dana will jump in at some point and comment about these religious overlays. It's just another aspect of Saint Teresa's of the Sweet Hunter, which is this book right here. So then, speaking of philosophy and ideas, I'm going to read a poem in the Widow's Crayon box that isn't a sonnet, after I make some comments about sonnets to answer your question, Donna. I've written tons of sonnets. It is when I found the sonnet, I found a way to be explosively emotional in a compressed period of time. And I began writing poetry in the heat of my emotions, really as a girl, and certainly then in my 20s when it became imperative for me. And I didn't know what to do with all of that heat. I couldn't write the prevailing idea of poetry, which was free verse. I started writing in the 1960s. No one was interested in form at that point that I knew of. But I had the great good luck to study the metaphysical poets in college, and attached to the sonnet. And for me, it's not jail. The sonnet is not jail, and it's not even a container. For me, the sonnet is a skeleton. It is the bone structure inside something, and also it allows me to be wildly emotional, careening from feeling to feeling, because it's going to have to end. There's a line limit. I've chosen a limit, but I've never written a sonnet sequence in my whole life of writing. I didn't kind of get them. I mean, I loved reading them, but I just didn't know. I didn't have the impulse to write one until my husband died, and I wanted to write about the process of grieving and who he was and what our marriage was, but I didn't have the wherewithal to keep starting a new poem and then starting a new poem. And the sonnet sequence, once you write the first one, you've got the last line, it's going to begin the next one. So it was as if the sonnet sequence was putting its arm around me, helping me from, emotional place to emotional place. And I read one of the sonnets in in the book, and I'm a little bit torn here about whether to continue on with that or to respond to the idea of ideas that Dana was talking about.
You could do
I'm gonna
both.
I could. Oh no. Let me go with a poem called "The Next World." It's one of ideas, which is not a sonnet, and then I'll return to one of the sonnets. And this is about medical assistance in dying, which we have in Canada and which certain states in the United States have. Oregon being the one I know the best. And the just circling back to the physical and the spiritual, which is, I think, what we keep talking about here. Medical Assistance in Dying, Toronto is the subtitle of the poem called "The Next World is One of Ideas." About his death, we talked without words. And I'm just going to make an aside here. We weren't talking a lot. I was shocked at how much my husband and I could communicate with one another without saying very much at all. About his death, we talked without words. Then came time for the interviews. Loss of hearing, not quite total for either the old doctor or my husband. The doctor held a tiny amplifier, so they yelled. The whole floor knew his wish. Medical assistance in dying. 3 witnesses, list, pen, loop signed, X'd. A second doctor came in blue metallic glasses. The intervention. I've held cats for this. Now him. Soft favorite shirt. When he heard, in 15 minutes, he sank, went still as snow. No thrash, no rattle, just the glide, the long furred body I loved even to his death. My head on his chest, warm earth. I shifted not to hear his stopped heart. The clock was his last view. Held his hand until it cooled to a waxy gray. The suitcase waiting. The next world is one of ideas. Are those his? Glass shapes in the sun? His clear thoughts refract, all their angles made known. Have you received thoughts and wondered why they've not occurred to you before? They could be his. That's the next world is one of ideas.
That's such a beautiful idea that the thoughts that come to you are from someone that's gone.
It's just I mean, when there's my husband refused to have anything to do with an idea of the afterlife. So in some ways, I sort of made up an afterlife for him. He lived the life of the mind, and I just feel that ideas circulate through centuries and generations. And it's not that we don't have any new ideas, but many old ideas seem to recirculate.
Yes.
And I feel that. I feel the reincarnation of those ideas. Just add another kind of funky crayon in the crayon box of spirituality that we're evoking this afternoon.
Yeah.
Right.
Rebecca had a question in the chat. She said the poem you just read, she was curious about the decisions behind what sound like some interesting enjambments in that poem, since that poem is not a sonnet.
Oh, it is so not a sonnet. I couldn't even punctuate this poem. I wrote it with just the idea of, well, can I make it through this? Can I describe this emotional process and what was happening at the same time? And the lines are quite short, and most of them have like just a couple of stresses. And I'm just moving from short line to short line to short line. There aren't even really always fully formed sentences. And the only punctuation here is there's a parenthesis and a dash, and then some gaps that I built in. So it's almost the opposite of the ongoing, what I think of as the ongoing rush of the pentameter in a sonnet.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. I know we're getting close to, we've got about maybe 10 minutes or so kind of before we'll wrap things up. So I just want anything else that you would like to talk about, share with us, that because we're kind of addressing the questions as they come up. So anything else that's kind of come to mind?
Yeah. I would like to kind of feed back a little bit to what Molly's talking about here about the world of ideas, because I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't read one of Teresa's poems that is a very philosophical poem, because she was a philosopher. That is her primary role, really, as a writer. And we actually have someone on the call here who's a philosopher, Carrie Netterman from UT. So shout out to him too. This poem also is one of only two poems that Teresa wrote that is anything near a sonnet. This one is 15 lines. She has another one that's like the first 8 of the sonnet, the octave. But this one is a 15-line poem, and she managed to pack into it pretty much every single idea about the metaphysics of the problem of evil, which is the idea that how could there be a good God and so much evil in the world, right? God is good. Why did he make this world? And the poem is called God's Beauty. O beauty far beyond all beauties of the world, you cut without pain, and painlessly you ruin the love of mere creatures. What a knot you tie from two unequal things. I don't think you could unpick the bond of good to evil you fastened with such strength. You join the mortal, what need not be, with what must be eternal. Never ending, you end. Never needing to love, you love. And from nothing, you create.
I mean, she sounds like a fascinating individual. I don't know. I don't have a lot of knowledge about any saints, so I don't know a lot about her. So reading your book was really interesting to me. Do we want to each kind of wrap up with another poem or two? I don't see any more questions in the chat. If you have questions, audience, this is the time to ask them.
And this is a time for some shout outs from me. There are a lot of wonderful poets in this audience. So, here's Irina Nikolova must be staying up very late at night because she is zooming in from Bulgaria. So we're here with a group of people from Europe to North America. Holly Woodward is here, wonderful poet and artist who may be zooming in from Costa Rica. A poet who's written a lot of spiritual poems and was a poetic amanuensis to W.H. Auden is here, J. Chester Johnson, whom I met through the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. There are, I'm just shouting them out, Victoria Cone Michaels, who's written some wonderful sonnets, Leonore Tucker, a fabulous poet, Donna Gelagotis, Lee, Norman Stock, Carol Nolde has a wonderful, wonderful sonnets herself. Alice Gorman, who is both a poet and a nonfiction writer. Lisa Wiley, poet from Buffalo. So glad to see you in this audience. Cindy Frankel, poet from Detroit. Bonnie Reedinger, poet and visual artist, as well as Alicia Payne, who is here. Alicia is an actor and playwright who is the voice behind the audiobook of Flower Diary, one of my biographies. I just felt like I had to shout this out as much as I could. I probably missed somebody, and I'm dreadfully, please, you have my apologies, because I'm racing through the chat here looking at names, but just wanted to say that we feel, did I say Norman Stock is here? It's one of the wittiest and most laugh out loud poets we have. Just to say that the vibe from the Zoom room has enhanced our conversation
Yes.
today.
Yes. Can I quickly
yeah.
do some? Yes. I'd like to first of all thank my family who's here. Jim, John, and Joe Hess, my husband and my two sons are here. And poet Alyssa Klein, essayist Alyssa Favero are here. And also, I mentioned Carrie Netterman, the philosopher, is here. Janine Holmes, poet and friend from advertising, is here. And I hope I'm not missing anybody. Oh, and David Kasdan is here, poet, artist, and friend. I don't think I missed anybody, but
love all the
hello.
shout outs. Maybe you should have shout outs at the end of every poetry reading.
Yes.
Great way to think. But your conversation has been so rich today, and I'm so thankful that you're here, and thankful that the audience came to hear you. And we would love to maybe hear you each read one more poem to kind of wrap up this beautiful experience. I did just put the links again in the chat to both of their wonderful books, which hopefully if you don't have, you will all run out and purchase. That's the way you can support our poets who read on the series, is to buy their books. It's a world that needs as much poetry and spirituality and as it can get right now. So both of these books would be great ways to do that. So I'm not sure if you want to switch order and at the end here. I'm gonna go first, but
I'll go and then you wrap
Great.
up, Molly. How's that sound?
Okay, sounds good.
All right, I'm going to read something very short. I mentioned that Teresa wrote two poems that were kind of close to sonnets. This is the other one. I read one. This is the one. It's 8 lines. It is like the first 8 lines of a sonnet. And Teresa rhymed all her poetry. I only rhymed this one poem, and it is the end of the book. Just because I felt as half a sonnet, it just seemed to lend itself to a rhyme. It's called Joyful is the Heart in Love. Joyful is the heart in love. It gives to God its every thought, renouncing all it's crafted of, to find the peace and glory it has sought. Self-neglecting this heart must be, since all of its desires crave God's form. And living in this way, ecstatically, it skims the sea waves of the storm.
That idea of the storm and the sea waves, it's such a potent metaphor for the waves of one's feelings. And somebody just commented in the chat that it was beautifully translated, and yes, it is. I'm going to close with one of those, a very material poem that was in the October issue of Poetry Magazine and is in this book. And it's one of the two apple poems in the book. Usually I read the last poem, which is called Honey Crisp, but this is a different one called Widow in Kitchen with Yellow Apple. And also I think that Jack Lynch is in this in this Zoom, who has his own history, his own spiritual history as a monk and a writer, and it's wonderful to know that you're here. Widow in Kitchen with Yellow Apple. You burst through the door, wheeling your red Swiss Army suitcase. How had you packed all you needed in that for 10 months? And I, in my stained yoga pants, stood gaping with delight, my little red paring knife in one hand and a yellow apple in the other. You're home, I smiled, my face stretching so wide I'd forgotten skin could be so elastic. And as you bumbled in with your suitcase, had you brought me a present? Your beard needed a trim. You looked up and said, "Yellow?" I only buy yellow apples now, I almost said, but instead chirped, "It's time for the new crop of Honey Crisps." Red, round. "I'll buy you some red ones," I said, looking in your pain-free face, tired from a journey, but exhilarated to be home. Eyes bright green. We hadn't even kissed yet. It was Saturday, and I had to stick my hair in a band and grab my jacket, or there would be nothing left at the farmer's market. So I almost stumbled into you in my rush to supply your wants, slightly turning my ankle against the wheel of your red Swiss Army suitcase, disappearing against the door, so securely locked. Big white rectangle shut. You'd been so real. Each hair of your beard glistened with the outside's cold air. The hair on your knuckles, gripping the black handle, curled in little squiggles as if drawn by a fine line marker. I saw them, the point of my red paring knife poised at the yellow peel. You'd been so real.
So beautiful. To be to end on such tenderness is a gift. Thank you for that. Thank you both, Dana and Molly, for your time, for your wonderful conversation, for your beautiful poems. Thank you, audience, for being here to kind of wrap up our third year of the series. Once again, if you know someone who missed today's conversation, the video should be up on YouTube either this evening or tomorrow morning, depending on how long it takes me to get my act together. And please feel free to share it with them. You can find our YouTube channel just by searching 100 Pictures of Honey. And we hope that you will share this beautiful conversation with anyone that can't be here. Dana,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I just forgot one shout out. Mackenzie Winter, the photographer. There, I'm done. Go ahead.
Well, then I'm going to shout out. I'm shouting out to you, Donna. Thank you so much for the idea of this series, for the name, 100 Pictures of Honey. How good is that? And just a shout out to say that you've got a book of poems coming out, and to thank you. Thank you so much. And Dana, thank you.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you.
And
Yeah.
Donna,
So now,
thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
So now I have to shout out Jack Gilbert for giving me the title for the series, right? So
Uh,
that's
Okay,
all right.
yes.
If you
Yes.
don't know that, I'd say that's a line in Forgotten Dialect of the Heart.
Yes. And
Um,
I want to say, Donna, that you do such a beautiful job facilitating and gently and intelligently moving the conversation into really interesting directions. And I really appreciated that today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks to all of you again for being here. Thanks to Dana and Molly. And we hope that in 2025, we'll see you at some other 100 Pictures of Honey readings. I'm going to stop the recording and then I can let people unmute at that point if they'd like. Okay.